Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Infinite Learning's webinar. My name is Rebecca Anand. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Infinite Learning. We are delighted to be running this webinar today in partnership with Natalie Croome, and we welcome her back this time to speak about bilingual and multilingual classrooms, supporting young language learners across the curriculum. Now, Natalie has developed this webinar as an introduction to our forthcoming virtual course of the same name. Today will be a discussion for all teachers and leaders of children of 3 to 12 years of age who are learning in a second or additional language, because we are all language teachers. We'll consider how our own language learning experiences can be leveraged to help us support our young learners. And time will be spent considering a range of text types and their structures, and acknowledging that there is a difference between language learning, formal, and language acquisition, functional. Now, before I hand over to Natalie, the expert in all of this, just a few small areas of housekeeping. Attendees are automatically on listen-only mode, and will allow Natalie to deliver her presentation in full, and then have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to use the chat area to ask a question at any point during the presentation. And we'll use the last 15 minutes of the webinar to answer as many of these questions as possible. To answer some of your more logistical questions in advance, a video recording of this webinar will be sent to you tomorrow, along with a short webinar survey and also your certificate of attendance. So that won't arrive until tomorrow at about 5 p.m. Okay. We would be grateful for your feedback, because we do read that and we share that with Natalie. It's most useful to us. Immediately after the webinar, we will send you a PDF of the PowerPoint, and there's an additional resource as well that Natalie has very kindly shared with us. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Natalie Croome. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks very much. And hi to everybody from wherever you're joining us from. It's really nice to know there are people out there interested in this particular subject. I know there are a lot of people who probably already have a good background in this. And so what I'm going to do today is really a big picture look at the idea of bilingual and multilingual classrooms, with a view to covering some or uncovering some issues that we can explore further in our course, which starts on the 7th of September. It's a 6-part course. So if you're interested in continuing this learning, don't be frustrated if not everything gets dealt with today, because that won't be possible. I hope that you've enjoyed some good holidays, and that you're ready to come back to whatever this environment is that greets you at the beginning of the new school year. I know I'm talking to a group of people who are nothing if not flexible, because that's what teachers are good at being anyway. But I know that you have a lot of other things you're dealing with on top of the thing that you really love to do, which is teaching. So I think about you as you launch into what could be a school year full of change and daily challenge that's on top of the workload you have. We're going to be looking today, one of the things we'll look at is the difference between, it's really about mindset in a lot of things about education. So thinking about whether we see things as a challenge or whether we see them as something, as a resource and something rich that we can use. And bilingualism, multilingualism very often falls into those two areas in terms of people's mindsets. Please just bear with me. I'm talking to you from the south of France. I'm sitting outside where the internet connection is best, but it's slightly windy, so I hope that's not going to affect the reception too much, but I hope that you can hear me well. So let's get started. I'd like to acknowledge that it's often uncomfortable for me to sit and just talk to people. It's not really my style. I really like the idea of interacting, and that's when I learn too. But I wanted to therefore acknowledge that that we're a mixed group of people today, and as Rebecca said, particularly in our international schools, we are all language teachers. And I know sometimes people groan a bit at that because they have their subject to teach. But if we're teaching children who are language learners, and really all teachers, all students are language learners anyway, even in their mother tongue, we really do need to address the fact that as we're communicating in a language, we are teaching that language, we're modeling that language. So here you'll see the list of people. It's a broad group of people who might be joining us today, and I've deliberately included people who teach specific subjects like music and art and physical education. I'm talking to perhaps some librarians, also people who are specialists, and I know that being specialised in this field, some of what we talk about today you may already be aware of, but this will give us sort of a level playing field where we'll clarify a few things as we move through our presentation. So welcome to you all, and if you're not included in that list, then it might be nice in the comment box if you can write what you do so that we can understand better the audience here. The outcomes for today are three, and I've broken our talk into three parts that follow pretty logically these outcomes. The first one is really going back to the basics of defining and clarifying our terms, the terms we use, both bilingual and multilingual, which are in part in the title, but also other terms. And I think I'm sure you've found that as you've moved around the world, people use the same terms to mean different things, and people use different terms to mean the same things. And so sometimes it's good to be reminded that when you start a school year, you really need to go back and clarify what you mean by certain terms. So that's one of the things we're going to look at. And then we're going to describe the challenges and strengths of these diverse language environments. Some people might be teaching for the first time, or they might be early in their experience of teaching in classrooms where there's a lot of different languages moving around and being used for learning. And other people may be very experienced with this. And when we look at the course, we'll look at interacting and help letting you share strategies that you've developed, because sometimes different contexts will have allowed you to view what was a challenge now as something that's a strength or a richness about the language environment of a classroom such as the ones we work in. And then our third outcome is appreciating how important mother tongue is. This is something I'm very passionate about, and it's because of my teaching experience and because of what I have come to believe based on research, that we really need to value and honour mother tongue in our classrooms, because that's where language starts and that's where language lives. And the more we understand about how we acquire new languages, the more we realise that mother tongue plays a key role. So let's move on. You'll just see in the next page I'm going to show you again what we're doing here in the three parts. As if we don't do as much coverage as you'd like on all of the parts, that would be great feedback. If you'd like some things covered in more detail, or if you've got questions, certainly at the end we can address some questions. If you've also got questions that could follow on into future discussions in the course, then that's also interesting to know. And that's what I've said in this next page here. Please think about responding and interacting. So trying to not be too passive, but be involved, because that helps me, and I think that helps you as learners and thinkers too. So some ideas I have for you responding and interacting are for you to give us written comments that we can address later or in the course to follow. For you to write your own reflections. I'll be asking you questions about your own profile as a language learner, and think about that, because you can leverage that to help you think about your student learners. You also, the translanguaging article that comes, I'm going to finish off today talking about translanguaging and the importance of mother tongue there. But the article that I'm sending you is something that based on a study that was done in The Hague in an international school in a multilingual environment, and it's a really interesting read, and I think it's great for you to read and to share with people back at school. Okay, so we're in part 1 and we're looking at defining and clarifying the terms. As I've said, bilingual and multilingual are key terms, but also we'll be looking at some other terms. Stay with me, even if you think you know, or you believe you know, or you do know. Just stay open to this and see if this resonates with what you think. So when we talk about our classrooms, I think it's interesting, are we talking about the learner? Or are we talking about what's being learned? Or are we talking about the approach to learning? And so now we break down bilingual and multilingual into several different levels of what a teacher is thinking about. I'm just going to hone in on bilingualism here, just to remind us about how diverse that one aspect of language acquisition or our language learners can be. So if we think about our learners, whatever age they are, we're thinking particularly about younger language learners. They can be one of a variety or one of these sort of classifications or somewhere in the middle of bilingualism. So we can have a passive bilingual. Some people call these students, what do we call it, a selective mute, which is not one of my favorite terms. I know what it's like. As a language learner, I've learned Kiswahili when I worked in Tanzania for 16 years, and I'm now in the process of learning French, and I'm not a selective mute at all. But at a certain time in my language development, I've definitely been a passive bilingual, which is where I'm strong in my mother tongue, but I'm capable of speaking another language, but I'm not confident. Sorry, I'm capable of understanding it, but I'm not confident to speak it yet, or I don't have the skills. And you may have students like that. I'm sure you do or have had. Semi-bilingual, which is perhaps the greatest at-risk group. Passive bilingual students are going to move through some of these other stages, but our semi-bilingual students are students who do not have an academic proficiency in any of the languages that they speak. They may be able to socially cope in one or more languages, but they are not ready for academic learning and thinking and processing. Because they have no strong mother tongue, these students may need some, it says there, they may be academically remedial. They may need support in both languages or the learning languages of the school. So sometimes we find this profile where a child will need ESL support and also, for example, Arabic support, because it's perceived that that's their mother tongue, but maybe they haven't got that strengthened enough to be confident as academic people. Okay, then we go on to coordinate bilinguals. These are people who have learned a tongue and they usually have a strong mother tongue which dominates, but they're on the road to becoming more bilingual, but because they've learned their second language in a very different environment, either in a school or as an adult or in a different country or in a language course, their languages remain perhaps parallel a little bit, or if at best they coordinate and they may meet, but they are really more confident and dominant in one language, and they keep their two languages slightly separate in the way they use their languages and the way they view themselves as language users. Now we've got the compound or bilingual or the dominant bilingual. This is the person who learns to live in the same environment, and their language is very much connected to conceptual understanding. So they have hooked vocabulary and for example, even language structure together, and they see their languages as more part of a whole rather than two separates. Usually these two people are also more proficient in one of the two languages. But this is getting deeper into conceptual understanding and not just superficial language learning. And then our ambi-bilingual, I remember this one thinking about ambidextrous, being able to use both hands equally. And so this person is what you might think of, I've put that in inverted commas there, the ideal bilingual. There are those amazing people you meet, and if they speak English, they speak it with an English accent of wherever they've learned their language, their English, and if they're Danish, they'll speak Danish with a Danish accent, so that speakers of that mother tongue will perceive them as native speakers. This is most likely to happen if the language is picked up in childhood or early years. It means that they are really non-accented in that language. So looking at the range just of bilingualism, you might like to think not only about where you might be if you're a bilingual person, but also think about your students. So each one of these different ways of, or different levels of proficiency in language learning as a bilingual learner require different kinds of teaching. And so that can help you assess and group your students based on their proficiency and how they perceive themselves as language users. As I said earlier in that screen before, are we talking about the learner? Or when we're talking about my school is bilingual or multilingual, are we talking about our language learning policy? And so I'm talking about this particularly because it's the beginning of the year, and it might be a good idea to go back and clarify what it is that you do at your school and understand what your school does. So you'll see here, I won't go through this too much. I know there's a fair bit of text here, and it's something you can look at later. But we've got anything from bringing students into a language centre, which is quite separate to everything else. It might even be something they do before the school year starts. It would be really considered as a language course because of what might be thought of as a perceived language barrier. This child may not speak any of the target or the language that's being used as the language of instruction in the school. And so this is really that focused on BICS. You may or may not have heard about that. So we're talking about saying hello and my name is, and today is Wednesday, and so on. So really social interpersonal skills. Then if you, the two sections in the middle there are about different approaches to EAL, and we'll look in a minute of what we're going to call, what you call what you do. But you may be pulling students out, or you may be pushing the EAL teacher into the classroom. And sometimes, it's certainly been my experience that many international schools have a mix of both of those. So sometimes the students will go out of the classroom and focus on speaking, listening, reading and writing skills. And sometimes that will be very language learning focused. And then sometimes the specialist will come into the classroom and help the student manage in that mainstream context where they're doing what all the other students are doing. And both are really valuable. And then you've got the idea, if you're looking for some kind of really proficient bilingualism, we're looking at an immersion program where we really dig into things like text types and helping children understand how language is used differently in different academic situations. So just be aware that when we speak about our school, we may be speaking about our learners. We may be speaking about the way we meet the needs of our learners, or we may be thinking more, we can also think about what we call it in schools. And I think this is interesting because there are so many acronyms, and as I was searching on the internet just to see what other people are saying about this, people say it drives them mad because there are so many different acronyms that are being used in schools, and these are just the four most common. So moving from English as a foreign language, where you're really learning a language which you may not really use even. So my example here is when I learned French at high school in Tasmania, I didn't really learn French. It was, as I said there, it was actually French as a foreign language, not English as a foreign language. It was never intended to make me a French speaker, and it was really an academic exercise. If you look at the next two, I think most of us understand English as a second language being a situation where either the country or the setting, for example, the school, is English is the lingua franca. It's the language that's used there in that setting. And this assumes that our learner has one language already and they're proficient academically for their age in their mother tongue. Then if we look at English as an additional language, it simply means that you've got a student who may be Dutch and French, and they speak them fluently as a bilingual person, and they're academically and age appropriately bilingual, and they're learning an additional language. It may be a third or fourth or fifth language when they're learning English. What I think is happening now is that we are recognizing that all students are language learners, including teachers, and so I'm seeing a transition to this bottom term of ELA. So we're talking about English language acquisition, all of us on some kind of continuum, none of us ever having really mastered our language, even if we are mother tongue speakers, and some of us really beginners. And if we think about us all being acquirers of language, then I think it helps us understand more about differentiation and appreciating the stages that our learners go through. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really interesting for those of you who may be working in for example, in the UAE, or where I worked previously for 3 years in Qatar, that you may be in a diglossic language environment, and you may know that you are, or you may not yet be aware, because I've worked with quite a few teachers who didn't realize this, and so I don't want to be patronizing in any way here, but I just think it's important for us to realize that our students for example, Arabic being one of the classic languages, Swiss German is another one. Our students are learning it's not a second language, but when they go to their Arabic classes, the language is so different to their mother tongue that they could be, it's a strongly different dialect, and they could be considered as being multilingual learners. So if you read that definition, the situation in which two languages or varieties of the same language are used under different conditions within a community. So if you have a look here in the Arabian or Persian Gulf, we have what is called the low version of the language, and I only use low because that's what's out there in the research, not because of any value of the language. But the countries that are listed there, the dialect, the Gulf Arabic dialect, is called Khaliji. And so those children, as mother tongue, they will be speaking Khaliji. The high version of the language, interestingly in Arabic, is purely liturgical. So it's purely for ceremony and ritual. It's memorized. It's speaking verses of the Quran. And learning some kind of intonation that goes with that. It's not really anyone's native or mother tongue. It's a purely formal, purely written language. One of my colleagues in Doha explained it to me a little bit, just to help me understand, explained it to me as if we were teaching Shakespeare. So the language is connected, but it's so far removed that you really have to analyze it and think about it in a different way to the language you're speaking with your mum and dad. Also acknowledging that our children may be coming to us with another language, which is going to put them in that semi-bilingual box that we looked at earlier, where they may have Indonesian or Malaysian or Thai or Filipino language that may even be stronger than their mother tongue, which is going to be Khaliji in this case. And so it's really important to remember that when those children go to their Arabic lesson, they're not learning their mother tongue. And this is something we can really discuss in the course, and there's a lot of interesting studies about it. But I just think it's interesting for you to realise that your students may not actually be practicing their mother tongue at school because it's not considered the official Arabic, and if we can't support their mother tongue development, we know that their other language development is going to be delayed, which can explain why it might take them longer to get where we would want them to go as language users in an academic sense. So still talking about this terminology, is this about the school's language learning policy? And so Rebecca mentioned right back in the introduction here that we can talk about language learning. How do we approach the learning in the school? Do we work on a behaviourist from that behaviourist psychology background or foundation, where we repeat and we drill and we teach parts of language in isolation, which is called formal learning experiences? So today we're doing verbs, or today we're looking at where the verb goes in the sentence, or today we're saying words over and over again to try to repeat them and put them into our long-term memory. Or are we looking more at the process which is more natural of language acquisition, which is going to be looking at a whole language experience where all parts of language are involved? And these next screens are going to talk to us about that. Sorry, let me just show you here. We're going into part 2, looking at the potential challenges and strengths of diverse language environments. So do we see language as a problem? And do we push back on something if we don't understand it in our own language? Or do we use it as a resource to say, how can these students who may be even struggling, how can we advertise and celebrate the strengths they have as they may slowly be learning language, because their brain is developing in such an amazing way that we need to acknowledge and give them time as well. So as we move into this looking at the classroom environment, I always like to think of Michael Halliday's work, and this is my little synthesis of what he talked about, which is very much part of really is the foundation of the PYP, for example, the PYP approach to language teaching and learning. So we talk about the 3 parts of language learning, and you can think about all of these as monolingual, bilingual, or multilingual aspects of learning. So learning language, which means it's really that the phonics, the phonemic awareness, the phonological awareness. It's about it can be about vocabulary. It's really about how to say language, pronounce. So for example, when you learn a new language, there may be a new sound. Like I'm challenged with the r in French. I didn't have to have that sound before, but now I have to try to produce that sound, and I have to do it very deliberately, and sometimes it's too exaggerated, and sometimes I don't get it. So that's part of learning the language. And then we've got learning about the language, which is really our grammar and punctuation and structure, or what we might call the syntax. Back to that first circle or oval here, it's the graphophonics piece. So learning about language is where we start to think about word order and word choice, and being able to make a sentence, structure a sentence or a paragraph to communicate. And I'm not speaking about writing there, even in an oral language sense. And then we get learning through language, which is really our subjects and our content. And sometimes I think that a lot of our special teachers perhaps are focusing on that learning through language box, and forgetting that the children who are still learning the language and learning about the language need support as they're learning through the language. So if they're learning science or if they're learning music, they still need that reminder, or the teacher needs to be very aware that these bilingual and multilingual students need support in those other two areas of the language learning, because you in your subject are dealing with specific terminology and structures that maybe other teachers don't deal with. So when we get to looking at how that might be synthesized from, I mean, this is really a pedagogical standpoint, but I would say this for all language learners, even if we're in a monolingual environment. But from a whole language background and belief system that I bring to my work, I'm looking at meaning rather than structure. I'm looking at communication and comprehension first and correctness later. And I know that as a language learner, I appreciate it when people allow me to make mistakes when I'm speaking in a second language, because their focus is on communication. And so I know as teachers there are students who repeat the same mistake. They make the same mistake, and you can find yourself saying, but I've already told you that. But it takes, we talk about 17 repetitions that it takes a child in a mother tongue to pick up a new word at minimum, you know, that's a minimum. So we're looking at that being possibly doubled, and perhaps more for bilingual and monolingual learners. Also with this diagram, as I've brought those circles together, the idea for you in your planning for your bilingual, multilingual learners is to try to either get in a place where you've got two of those circles overlapping. So you might be looking at graphophonics and semantics, or syntax and semantics in one lesson, or ideally you're operating right in the middle, so that a lesson might deal with some specific pronunciation, some specific structure of language and the subject you're teaching. If we can plan like that, we're more likely to meet the language learning needs and the language acquisition approach than we are if we're trying to teach these things in isolation, or we're leaving it to the language teacher. Okay, excuse me, have a look at this next screen. I just need a little drink of water. This is another way of looking at it. I've moved the circles deliberately because they don't always have to be the way they were, but this is another way of, it's another interpretation of the same thing. This comes from First Steps, which some of you may know. This is my interpretation of what First Steps promotes and is structured around. So that's a language learning continuum from Western Australia. And so we look at, this gives us a little bit more focus on what might you be looking at when you're looking at semantic cues, syntactic cues, and graphophonic cues. I know I'm glossing over something that, you know, we could spend hours just on this, but I'm just looking at a big picture about helping you plan and helping you pull some of these elements together into lessons, so that you're operating right again in that little central area where it all comes together in a whole language context. And that's when functional language happens. If we formalize it, it means we've separated the circles and we've separated a piece out of the circles, and we're just looking at that, and it may not have context for the learner. But having said that, I know there are times when you do really feel with a whole class or with a group that you do need to focus, especially some bilingual students who are on a different end of that spectrum of acquiring a second or additional language. They may need some real structure so that they can get the context. But they're the big decisions that you make as a teacher. Okay, so having a look here then, we're describing our language learning classrooms in greater detail. I do like my circles. I like to think of how things are separate and then how they come together. So thinking here about the quote at the bottom, that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Think about that from a student's point of view when they're coming into your classroom. They want to succeed, they want to communicate, they want to learn, but they can be limited. And one of the activities that I like to do with teachers is to ask them to change that statement to take the words limit out and to talk about more about opportunity and what teachers could be doing to help open up some of those doors so that students can feel less limited when they're in classrooms, when they're in our classrooms. So if we look at the nature of a bilingual classroom, we're looking at teachers and students who speak 2 languages. So it could very well be in some of the schools you're in that they speak Arabic, a form of Arabic, and they speak English. And you'll often, in earlier years, you'll have 2 teachers who are both speaking those languages as mother tongues. But remember, in Arabic speaking schools, those teachers may be speaking MSA or Fusa, the formal form of Arabic. They may not be speaking the child's mother tongue. That the 2 languages, ideally, in a good bilingual program, will be seen as having equal value. And both of the languages are used as learning languages. So we might be reading stories in both languages. We might be doing our mathematics in both languages, or our play. They're some of the big characteristics of a bilingual classroom. A multilingual classroom, we've got more of a situation where the teacher and the students are speaking a diverse range of languages. There may be lots of translation going on. There may be a couple of, German children who need to do some interpretation for one another, or some translation, and there'll be a whole range of those levels of proficiency in terms of bilingualism. Obviously, someone's not multilingual until they're bilingual, but a classroom can be multilingual, therefore sort of jumping that bilingual step in terms of the big view of the classroom. That classroom community can have monolingual speakers in it as well, and bilingual and multilingual, depending on the school's language policy. Maybe that there are some students who might be those passive bilinguals, maybe bridging from monolingual to passive bilingual, but this helps you think about who your students are and where they are in their language learning, and where you are also as a language learner. All of the languages are valued in this environment, but one is used as the language of instruction, and in the case of, I assume, of the schools you're working in, it's going to be English. So those points in the 2 circles at this side, at the 2 sides, are the same, and I've just brought it together to talk now about the challenge, these strengths as I see them, the richness and the resources here. You've got this broad language toolkit, so children can say things in different ways. They can learn other people's languages that are not intended as their learning languages. Identity is preserved because we know that our language is hooked to our culture, and that's very much a part of giving us our identity. So we need to be valuing languages for that reason as well. Teachers and students are all perceived as language learners, and it's a very rich classroom because we can express things, we can share things in lots of different ways, including different languages. As you know, really everything about the mindset that you have and the attitude you have towards your student, your language, the language experiences, the language learning experiences you've had will really be a foundation for the way you teach. If you feel intimidated by language, it'll affect the way you teach language. And so here's just a question for you, thinking about, are you monolingual, meaning you understand a few other bits and pieces, but really you speak one language? Or are you bilingual? Are you becoming bilingual? Or are you multilingual? It's really important for us to acknowledge our own language learning situation. And in the course, we'll have a look at that, because as we go on to this next slide, I'm sure we've all been isolated because of language at some time in our lives. And as international teachers, we probably have been more than most other people. And these are questions which I'm going to flick through, because if you join us for the course, we'll look more at this and how you can use some of these experiences to really think about what, again, it's that idea of leverage. What can we do to leverage our own experiences to help us better meet the needs of our language learners? And we may not be really trained as ESL teachers, but we find ourselves in ESL or language acquisition situations, and we're expected to meet the needs of our students. So sometimes really reflecting on how we feel. We may dislike a language purely because we were put in a very stressful situation regarding that language, and so it has turned us off, and we want to make sure we don't do that for our students as well. So maybe you can come back and have a look at that at some time in the future. So what we'll do, I just wanted to run through this. You can have a look at some of these attitudes we might have, and the idea of speak English policies in schools is something I'll expand on in the course, and we'll be able to discuss. I'd really love to have some discussion on that. But just remembering that language and concept, while they are in two different parts of the brain, they're really connected. And so if I show you this little example of the idea of knowing that in English the word for there's a word orange, and I have a concept for orange. I know that orange can be a fruit and orange can be a color. And I'm going to use my mother tongue to help me connect the French, which is the same spelling but a different pronunciation. And then in Kiswahili, it's machungwa, not connected at all to my other two languages, but I'm hooking the French and the Kiswahili onto my concept of orange. And I know, in this case, I know that orange means a color and it also refers to a fruit, so I can start generalizing. And so all of my languages are being synthesized. I'm not keeping them in separate boxes. And so once I know that, then I can start using that to hang other concepts on, or I can use my orange to help me describe other things. And so one of the things, I'm just looking here at the time, the article on translanguaging, which you're going to get, is a really interesting read on how important it is to value mother tongue in classrooms and allow some of that to happen for children to take notes or to write drafts in their mother tongue, and how that really does help them improve in the target language. It doesn't delay their learning. It helps them connect definitely conceptually. And here's my last point, which I think is really interesting. That bottom little statement there on the screen is just worth thinking about. It's a bit of a provocation, the idea of domination through language, which we have to be really careful about. So do you believe that languages are separate beasts? Do you think that English is over here and Arabic's over there, or do you believe that they're the same species and they live together? And if you have a heteroglossic view, you will believe that languages complement one another. If you have a monoglossic view, you'll believe that languages almost hinder one another. And so there's the invitation to come and join the course and look at how these different theories really have an impact on our teaching, and the evidence that is out there in the research certainly is moving more into the area of heteroglossic view, which is where we know that there's a language part of the brain, and if we are not allowed to use our mother tongue, our language learning will be very superficial. Okay, I'm just looking at the time, and I realise that we've perhaps gone as far as we need to go in this part of our session. It's been fast and furious. I'm interested to see what kinds of comments have come up for you, or any questions. And if we don't get to answer them all today, please do consider joining us in the course so that we can have more discussions in a more intimate kind of situation. And we'll be able to go back and have a look at some of these issues that perhaps have been glossed over in this short presentation. Okay, so that's it from me, and I'll hand you back to Rebecca to see where we go next.
Oh, Natalie, thank you so much. As an ex-language teacher myself, and then a language learner still, I have to say I found much of that absolutely fascinating. And I think in the environments in which we work,
Yes.
such multicultural international schools, which makes the learning environment so rich and wonderful. My three children have friends of all sorts of different nationalities, and I think the importance of all teachers understanding those different dynamics and different language backgrounds that students will come into the classroom with. Just having that little taster there makes me realise just how important it is, and certainly as a language teacher, actually would be it would have been really useful for me to have known some of this stuff before I was actually when I was actually teaching languages. So thank you very much for sharing your obvious passion and enthusiasm for this area, and some tremendous expertise and knowledge as well. I'm just going to have a quick look and see if we've had any questions here. Guys, we're still there, please. You know, we've got another 10-15 minutes left. If you've got any questions at all that you'd like to put to Natalie, either about things that she shared here or about what the course itself might entail, please do let us know. We've had questions about copies of the slides, etc. And yes, as I said at the start, we will send those out along with an additional resource that Natalie has kindly shared with us. And tomorrow at 5 o'clock, you will receive a recording of this webinar and indeed your certificate of attendance. So hopefully that answers those questions. We don't have many other questions other than some lovely comments saying thanks a lot, very interesting presentation. Just a statement here from Rani, who just says languages complement each other. So it's not a question, it's a comment. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that, Natalie.
Or perhaps that was a response to that sort of, it was a question I mentioned at the end about whether you've got that heteroglossic or monoglossic worldview or view about language, and so maybe that person was excited to say, I believe languages complement one another, which is definitely more borne out by the research than that monoglossic idea of languages in boxes. So that's good to know.
Okay, great. Any other questions from everyone? Yes, Rani's confirmed it was a response to that. Christine saying thanks a lot for that interesting presentation. I don't know if anybody else has got any comments or questions. No, you're feeling a bit shy today, maybe just a bit tired. I know most of you are all back at work and dealing with a sort of information overload of how you must operate under the new COVID protocols that are changing by the day and thrust upon us all. So hopefully this was perhaps a little light relief from the world of COVID and something that's perhaps more interesting and closer to your hearts. Just have one final check, and if there's nothing there, just more thank yous. It was really informative. Yes, I absolutely agree. It was fascinating stuff. So in that case, I'll just do a little conclusion and share some information with you. And if any questions come in the meantime, we'll just check those in a moment before we actually say our goodbyes. But thank you again for that webinar, Natalie. Really useful. We had you know, about 40 of you here in attendance and many more that registered who will therefore automatically receive the information. If you think of a question that hasn't been answered here after the webinar, or indeed if you'd like any other advice on EAL training, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We will be more than happy to assist. If Infinite Learning can't directly answer the question for you, we will obviously refer it to Natalie, who certainly will be able to. So just again, that reminder that the video recording of the webinar will be sent to you tomorrow along with your certificate of attendance and along with a short survey. So please do give us your feedback. And again, after this webinar, you'll receive an email with the PDF of this presentation and an additional resource. So now, as Natalie referred to, and I did as well at the start, we're running the related virtual online course with Natalie, entitled in the same way, Bilingual and Multilingual Classrooms, supporting your language learners across the curriculum. And this cohort is running from the 7th of September to the 23rd of November. You can visit our website, www.infinitelearning.ae, go to the e-learning section, virtual courses, and you'll see EAL there and all the details. And those face-to-face sessions are broken down over a number of weeks, so that gives you a chance sort of to take the learning back into your classrooms, back into your schools, and to really make it a blended learning program. So hugely valuable. The booking deadline is the 2nd of September, so have a little think. Obviously, as always with Infinite Learning courses, they are certified, so you will get your professional development hours of professional development certificate there as well. If you're interested in looking at any more webinars, the next one coming up next week on Wednesday, the 2nd of September, is all about a training course to enhance personal impact. So if you want to be have a powerful and positive presence, this could be the webinar for you. So that's next Wednesday, a week today at 4 o'clock. Do sign up. And that's, as I say, a virtual training program, an introduction to another virtual training program, talking about how you can maximize your presence and create a powerful impact on the people you meet and work with. So lots of NLP techniques in there, looking at how you can raise your possibility consciousness to ensure that you are on point to present the best version of you that you can be. I think we would all like to be able to do that all of the time. I think I'll certainly be tuning in for that one. So I'm just going to now have one more check on any questions, see if anything has come in whilst I've been nattering away there. Just bear with me. Okay, so thank you so much. This is from Anna Bice. Thank you so much. Very insightful indeed. Quick question. When I meet my 3-4-year-old Arabic children and their parents the first time, the parents always ask if they have to start speaking more English to the children now at home. I always, something, so please don't. I always say, please don't, continue speaking your language, your home language, and we will do the English here in school. Am I correct in saying this? Brilliant question, Anna, thank you. Natalie?
Yes, I think for sure if the one, because parents could be the only language resource for the children in their other language, and as we know, we're better to be having students being taught, that doesn't have to be by mother tongue speakers, but by people who are speaking the language, modeling the language well. And so it is a sensitive one, because you don't want to tell parents that, please don't speak English to your child because you don't speak it very well, but that can often be the case. And so then you get these bad habits and incorrect structures that go right through families and cultures, because that they may be good English speakers in their cultural group, but they might not be the best model. So I've got a few articles. I always find a little piece of research, because I think parents really appreciate that. And I think what I always do is talk about, valuing language and identity. You are the primary caregiver, you, the parent, in your mother tongue, and that's really important. So you keep doing that work, and we'll be doing this work in English at school. But then also, sending home activities that the children can do in both languages is really important, because very often the mother tongue gets lost in an academic sense. And so they might make a list of words that describe something, and they can do it in English, and then their activity with their parent would be to access some of those words in their mother tongue. So you can really let the parents be part of that learning without sort of separating them and saying, we won't be working together. That's just some couple of suggestions.
Great, and yeah, Anna's just said great tip about the research articles, Natalie, thank you. One other question here from Lata Kumari. How can we make the language acquisition less challenging? It's a big question. I think sign up for the course with Natalie and explore.
Yes. I do have lots of ideas and lots of research-based best practice for classrooms that we can look at, but it really is supposed to be less stressful and more natural. Language acquisition is really supposed to be looking at how children learn the mother tongue and how we can replicate some of those situations in a classroom, and really takes the stress out of the work, because it is a much more natural inquiry kind of approach, rather than a ticking lists off some sort of grammar checklist. So acquisition is fun, and yeah, if you join the course, you'll find lots and lots of strategies that we can use to acquire rather than to learn.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Natalie, again, and thank you all for joining us today and for those questions. Much appreciated. I hope you all found it enjoyable and beneficial, do take a look at the course and see if it's something that you think could be of interest. As I said, the sessions are broken down across weeks, so it's not too much all in one go, but you're going to get some really useful guidance and tips that you can take back into the classroom, and hopefully will really help you in your role. So Natalie, thank you once again very much, and we hope to see you again soon. And good luck to all of you as you continue and begin the start of term. It's a challenging time. You're doing an amazing job. You teachers deserve medals and gold cups and stars and everything. We're very grateful for all that you do. So keep working hard, keep safe, and we'll see you all soon. Many thanks.
Bye. Thank you.